the Flyers stole the headlines over the weekend. We'll have the latest on the trades and what it means. Plus, the expansion draft is coming up. Who's protected? Who was unprotected? Some big names. Kevin Durso covers the Flyers for 97.3 ESPN.com. It was a little quiet for the Fly guys, but Kevin, we heard Chuck Fletcher speak a week ago, and then he got active over the weekend, pulled off a deal, and he makes a trade sending the former number 2 overall pick in the draft, Nolan Patrick, and 24-year-old defenseman Phil Myers to Nashville. Well, Patrick went to Vegas after that for veteran defenseman Ryan Ellis. So it seems that the national talking heads are giving the Flyers high marks for this grade. Everywhere I've seen, they have been graded an A for this deal. So how did you view the deal that Chuck Fletcher made on Saturday?
This is a guy I think I've had my eye on like they have for a long time. I like Ryan Ellis's game. He seems to fit the bill of what they need. To me, this is the type of guy they needed to go out and get, someone who plays in all situations, handles the top pairing workload well, and can certainly do all of the little things you need to stabilize that top pairing just the way that Matt Niskanen did. I think that there's a few minor differences in his game than Matt Niskanen's, but for the most part, they are relatively similar in a lot of ways, down to their leadership abilities and the ability that they have to not only stabilize a pairing with Ivan Provorov, but also to be a mentor for the rest of the defensemen and kind of lead by example. So I think that this was a great fit. It checked all the boxes that the Flyers needed. You can use him in any situation. He'll play a lot of minutes for you. And you've got a long-term commitment as well, which I think was important.
Yeah, I guess the Niskanen thing is big. He abruptly retires on them. They never filled that void. You think Ellis not only fills that void, but maybe is a better fit than even Matt Niskanen was?
Yeah, I think so. And, I think that for some reason or another, and I don't know if it's just coincidence or whatever, but they keep coming back to Nashville a lot when it comes to making deals. The Flyers and the Predators make a lot of trades with each other. And this is just another example of it. It's a reminder. It's very reminiscent of what happened many years ago. The Flyers kind of came off of another disappointing year, unacceptable year, and then went out and started making offseason moves. And they acquired a defenseman who was in his 30s from Nashville, fit the same bill, and ended up being pretty good in Philadelphia. And that was Kimmo Timonen. So you've got a guy who kind of plays similarly in that sense, can certainly help your power play, is a very good defensive defenseman as well. Chuck Fletcher noted how good his transition ability is in terms of moving the puck out of your own zone and getting guys going the other way so that you have to defend less per se, which can certainly help cut down on goals against if you're moving the puck out smoothly and creating offense from it. So I think that all of that plays out well for them.
Obviously, the age and the contract. Is there some concern there?
Maybe a little bit at the end, but honestly, I was a fan of this because of the fact that I think that in the grand scheme of things, when we listened to the other names that came up as a defenseman who could fit the same description of playing top pair minutes, it kept coming back to Seth Jones and Dougie Hamilton. Dougie Hamilton's going to demand a lot on the free agent market. You're talking about a 7-year deal north of $8 million a year, and that's similarly a contract that I think you're going to regret down the line as it gets down to it. You're going to just lock yourself up again when it comes to cap space. The Seth Jones one is interesting because they definitely were involved with Columbus and trying to work out a deal there as well. But if Seth Jones wasn't going to commit beyond this season, I think the last thing Chuck Fletcher wanted was another Matt Niskanen situation where you get the solution for one season and then you're back looking for something else, or to have to negotiate that deal. What they know is you get 6 years with Ryan Ellis. It's at $6.25 million a year, and you can factor that in moving forward. So now you can address the other areas, knowing what you owe the top pairing defenseman that you have for the long-term future.
How do you see, we don't know what else is going to happen here, but obviously you would think Provorov and Ellis would play on the top pair. That leaves Sanheim with who?
I think it leaves Sanheim with someone who might not be here yet. Honestly, I think that that's another area that they would like to try to address. I think if I had to pick somebody who's currently on the roster, I would say Justin Braun. But I think that they would prefer if Justin Braun was on the third pairing, maybe with somebody like Cam York, if he's the guy who comes up and fills in a role there, especially if someone like Shane Gostisbehere is no longer on the roster. Then I think that Cam York has a shot at that opening slot there. You put Justin Braun with him, who's a veteran, who can stabilize his game a little bit because he plays in a defensive zone. And I think that the guy that they would really want to play with Sanheim, you got to go out there and try to get it maybe. And I think names like David Savard and Adam Larson are two that are out there that could certainly be attractive to the Flyers if they were to look for someone who can very similarly to Ryan Ellis stabilize that second pairing too.
What'd you think of the compensation? Were you comfortable giving up Myers and giving up on Nolan Patrick?
Yeah, I was, and I'll tell you why, because you have to give to get a little bit, obviously. But I think that when it comes down to it, Phil Myers, he could go on to become a really good player in this league. There's no question. He's already shown signs of that in the past. I don't believe he's going to be a top pairing defenseman. No, I think his peak is probably second pair. And honestly, you don't really have time to let him grow into that role or see if he pans out as a top pairing guy without addressing this issue. It was the biggest need they had in the offseason, and they took care of it. Nolan Patrick's a totally different story. I think that the writing was on the wall for him, that he struggled in every season that he's played at the NHL level, and he's gone long periods of time with a lack of production and some nights where he just looks downright invisible. And then you have the injuries and the concussions early in his career, the migraine syndrome that caused him to miss an entire season. I just don't think it was going to work out here. So it's a failed draft pick, no question about it. Could the change of scenery? He's got familiarity in Vegas with the GM, Kelly McCrimmon, who was actually his GM and head coach for a brief period of time with the Brandon Wheat Kings when he played juniors. So he's got familiarity there. Maybe that changes things for him, and he could become a better player. I just don't think there was any chance it was happening in Philadelphia. So to not only get something for him at this stage of his career, but to address your biggest need and to do it without giving up a lot of things that could have been involved in that deal. You didn't give up somebody who was even more established at the NHL level. It didn't start with a Travis Konechny or Travis Sanheim. It didn't start with a prospect like Morgan Frost or Cam York, and it didn't start with your current first-round pick, which certainly is still on the table. Chuck Fletcher said as much. The fact that you have all of that still in your pocket, ready to go for whatever you may need if you choose to do anything with that, and still address this huge issue that was facing you this offseason says a lot.
Kevin Durso, our Flyers insider. Flyers make that deal over the weekend. Ryan Ellis is here. Patrick is out. Myers is out. And now what's next? Well, let's take a look, Durso. First off, what's next on the checklist, do you think, for Chuck Fletcher?
That's an interesting one because certainly I think that, as I mentioned, another defenseman who can play with Sanheim and be in the second pairing would be an ideal thing to go get. They need a third-line center or somebody who can play center in the middle six, kind of where Nolan Patrick was playing previously. They need a backup goaltender. And yet we keep coming back to these rumblings about Vladimir Tarasenko. And that would be a goal scorer. That would be a guy who can excite some people. And it's interesting. I don't know if it's going to go any further than these rumors per se, but nonetheless, all of those areas are areas of need. So I don't know that you can actually pick one and just say that one's more important than the other at this point. You've already taken care of the most important one. You're going to need a goalie. I think that that's maybe the next most important one just because you're going to need someone to play behind Carter Hart. But beyond that, getting another forward who can play a decent two-way game, getting a defenseman for Sanheim, and certainly if you can address scoring on top of it, by all means, go for it.
He was left unprotected, correct?
Yes, he was.
Flyers unprotected list. Anything stand out to you?
Not especially. I think maybe a little surprised that it was Nick Aube-Kubel over James Van Riemsdyk. I think when they traded Nolan Patrick, a lot of people thought James Van Riemsdyk was going to get the protected slot just because he did have a solid year last year, all things considered. I mean, the team was not very good, obviously, but he did put up and produce good numbers throughout the season nonetheless. And yet it seems like the message is very clear from the Flyers with who they did protect and who they didn't. Nick Aube-Kubel is 25 years old. He's a role player. He's making just over $1 million on the cap. And when you look at that, he was quite possibly your best forechecking forward, best play driver 2 seasons ago when you had a lot of success. He might be one of these young players that you're banking on to turn it around next year and not willing to give up on so easily and figuring why let him be unprotected and go to a team like Seattle and only lose $1 million off of your cap when you could do so much more if you could get rid of one of these larger contracts. I think they're trying to back Seattle into a corner. I think they want Seattle to take one of these contracts. At worst, if it's Shane Gostisbehere, you get $4.5 million. At best, if it's Jake Voracek, you get $8.25 million in cap space. And that opens up some doors for you to do some things. So I think that's really what's, and again, I think the other two options beyond those three big names, because James Van Riemsdyk is a $7 million cap hit, so that would certainly add some cap space. I think the other two options beside that, Justin Braun's 34 years old and a veteran defenseman who's going to be on the last year of his contract, and Robert Haig's in the final year of his contract and probably a 6th or 7th defenseman at best. I don't think that you're leaving him unprotected and like not admitting that you're okay with losing a guy like that, because you can probably go out and replace that much more easily than the Matt Niskanen type like we saw over the last season, or much more easily than maybe guys who you have protected, like your Travis Konechny's, Sean Couturier's, guys like that. So you're protecting guys that you feel like you can't replace as easily, and I think you're leaving guys exposed that you go, it either opens up the door to do some big things with the cap, or you don't mind losing them.
Yeah, let's play hypothetically. Let's say Voracek got taken by Seattle.
Mm-hmm.
What does that now do for the offseason?
It depends on what they do with that to a degree, because the rumor with Vladimir Tarasenko involves Jake Voracek heavily. And if that's how you choose to replace Voracek's cap hit, and basically a player who plays the same position, makes $750,000 less per year and has one fewer year on his contract remaining, you give yourself somewhat a little bit more flexibility to an extent, because you're replacing him and giving yourself a little extra money and one fewer year, and it's kind of the lesser of two evils at that point with the contracts. If you don't get a player like Tarasenko, then you've got a lot of money. You're going to have probably in the range of $17.5 million of cap space to fill. You'll probably need another forward at that point beyond the third line center that we're talking about with Patrick being gone, but to fill 2 forward slots, depending on how you want to do it, the defenseman slot I talked about, the backup goalie, you have some room to play with there. And let's say that in addition to Voracek, that if Voracek's the guy who gets picked by Seattle, and that opens up the cap space that way, that you don't now try to also find a dance partner in the trade market for Shane Gostisbehere too, and open up another $4.5 million. Now you're up over $20 million in cap space. All of a sudden, you just created, this is what I was talking about last week with you, where this is getting creative to try to find ways to give yourself possibilities. And certainly this first trade for Ryan Ellis, and by not giving up really many assets at all and holding on to the possibility that Seattle can take this one of these contracts and give you some cap space and addressing your biggest need on top of it, that was getting creative. And Chuck Fletcher got off to a pretty solid start there with his offseason.
All right, we'll keep an eye on that. When is the expansion draft?
The expansion draft's Wednesday night. I wouldn't be surprised if, there's rumors flying around like crazy. I mean, the big one was that Carey Price was left unprotected by Montreal, and there's questions about his health, whether or not Seattle's going to sign off on still taking him, even though he may have health issues. It's going to be interesting, because there's certainly a lot going on, and the Flyers seem to be right in the middle of it, because I'm pretty sure at this point I've seen at least 3 or 4 names, with Tarasenko, David Savard, Adam Larson. There was rumors involving Rasmus Ristolainen from Buffalo. They're doing exactly what I thought they would do, which is checking in on just about everything you can.
Kevin Durso covers the Flyers for 97.3 ESPN.com. And, as you kind of hinted at, this could be the first of a couple of moves now for Chuck Fletcher. Are there current guys on the roster that should be keeping their cell phone handy?
Oh, that's good. I'm not sure how many of them. I think there's a few that know they're safer than others. Like, I think that they certainly, with the protection list, Claude Giroux doesn't need to worry about anything. Claude Giroux can enjoy the last few months of the summer and not have to worry about anything. I think Kevin Hayes is in that boat as well. Ivan Provorov is, Carter Hart is, Sean Couturier is. But, I think that there's a lot of people. I mean, I even think that even if you're Travis Konechny at this point, and I really think that by getting their biggest offseason need and not even going near that in terms of compensation, I think he's safe. But even that, you just never know. It depends on what they feel like they need to give up to get what they really want. I do think for sure, and certain, kind of the thing I was thinking about yesterday after, we chatted quickly about me coming on today, was I don't think this is the last time you're going to be talking to me this week, because I feel like there's certainly more coming. The draft pick thing already, as far as I'm concerned, I think that I'd be shocked if that wasn't traded. If he doesn't trade his first-round pick, for sure, in something.
Okay, so if you're trading your first-round pick, because in hockey, that's a little different from trading your first-round pick in, say, at the NBA or football.
Right.
What is your anticipation of getting back in return for a pick of that magnitude?
I'd be curious to see what direction he goes with it. If I've heard the reported trade that was, and this was from the guys at Crossing Broad who had this, that the reported trade possibility for Vladimir Tarasenko anyway would be that Jake Voracek would go over with a draft pick that was not a first to get Tarasenko from Seattle, who Seattle would select from St. Louis, and then Seattle's pick from Philly would be Robert Haig. And somehow or other it would line up. There was kind of a little bit of confusion whether or not Voracek would end up in Seattle or end up in St. Louis, but one way or the other, Vladimir Tarasenko would end up on the Flyers, and it wouldn't cost them anything more than 2 players and a draft pick that's somewhere in the middle, not the first. I would think that the first would be kind of required to get a player of that stature, even though certainly there's not a lot of leverage for any team who's going to give up Tarasenko, just given his situation, how he's done in St. Louis. That's the bottom line. He's done. And they don't have much leverage.
He was left unprotected. Seattle would take him, and they are now almost taking trade offers for him before they've even taken him.
Possibly. I mean, there's no guarantees they're definitely taking him, but the idea is that maybe what the Flyers are doing is kind of chatting with Seattle and saying, if you take this guy, if you take Tarasenko, we'll offer you this to get him, and then you can also select this guy in return also to kind of make up for the fact that that's how they get somebody from every team, like they have to do.
Right.
So there's definitely a side deal being worked possibly here.
Just to be clear for the people, because the expansion draft a couple of years ago with Vegas, it's the same. They get one guy from every team.
Right. And then they have the flexibility kind of to do with that whatever they would like to. So if they select Tarasenko from St. Louis and then decide to move him, then that's their choice to do so, and they still honored the obligation of taking somebody from every team. It would certainly be interesting. I'm certainly not, after seeing that report and all that stuff, I'm not saying that means that Tarasenko is going to be a Flyer.
Right.
There's the possibility. I certainly smell smoke with that one. I think that there's a big possibility of it, and it would certainly, if nothing else, because I know there's health concerns with him, and I know that there's a lot around it, but certainly this would be a type of player, on top of the fact that you went out and addressed your biggest need with a trade to get Ryan Ellis. I think this would certainly get the attention. I think a lot of people now with the Ellis trade, you've got people on the hook again. Like, you've got people's attention. Now you could reel them in even further if you go out and get basically a star talent. And because I don't think a lot of debate on whether or not he's going to ever get back to the form he was with his health, but no one's going to argue that Vladimir Tarasenko is a name that everybody recognizes.
Right, and
so that would certainly get attention.
There's further intrigue, Kevin, right or wrong, by the fact that Dave Hackstall is the coach in Seattle,
right,
and he may have a preference of, hey, I want this guy because I know what he can do, or he fits what I want to do. So we don't know which of the Flyers that is, but I'm sure there's some leverage that the Flyers can say, knowing that, hey, he had a really good relationship with this guy or this guy or this guy, So that's another intrigue for Wednesday.
Sure, and I think it's also fair to look at the fact that for a guy like Jake Voracek specifically, that Chuck Fletcher's admitted they've had that conversation. They've talked about the possibility that everybody knows they need to get better, and it might involve moving on. It might be time. And it seems like both sides understand that. So there's a lot of unpredictability here in terms of the types of guys that could be going. You could see a lot of different things happen. And I certainly at this point, now Ryan Ellis is the first of these players. I wouldn't be shocked if he's one of probably at least 3 or 4 new faces on this team. It might be pretty unrecognizable as you enter training camp, and you have to kind of play a get-to-know-you game with these guys because there's going to be new faces for sure.
Kevin Durso, he said he anticipates that he'll be back on the show sometime later this week, which means the Flyers would have made another move. But Wednesday, there's going to be something happening, obviously, because that's the night of the expansion draft. So one of those players, Voracek, JVR, Gostisbehere, Haig, or Braun, will not be here. Are they the only 5?
I mean, there's a whole long list of players, but basically they're mostly minor league depth type of guys. So more or less, I think that Seattle's not going to be looking at anything like that. And I think that that's the reason why Aube-Kubel was protected too, is because I really believe the Flyers think if they left him unprotected with the very small cap hit, the potential, at his age, that was the easy pick for Seattle. And you've just made it tougher on them by saying, here's a bunch of big contracts, or an aging veteran defenseman, or a guy who probably is more of a role player on your blue line if that's the way you want to go, but not a guy who's cheap at 25 years old and $1 million.
So the best case scenario Wednesday would be what?
I mean, the best case scenario, regardless of if they get anything back in a side deal, would be one of those 3 contracts going. I mean, I think that Gostisbehere would probably be the obvious choice if it's just taking a contract. I just have this feeling, And there's certainly a lot of rumblings around about it that something bigger is happening beyond just taking a player for Seattle. I think that there's something more to this than just, oh, it's as easy as taking Shane Gostisbehere, and that's the end of the discussion. I think there's more to it than that.
All right, Kevin Durso, at Kevin_Durso. Keep it locked to him. The next couple days for Flyer fans out there are going to be very interesting. We'll see if Chuck Fletcher pulls the trigger on another deal between now and then, or even on expansion draft night, which is Wednesday. And Kevin, we will check back in. Thanks, man.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mike.
All right, that's Kevin Durso, our Flyers insider, and you can follow him at Kevin_Durso.